If you're hearing this episode around the time it comes out, it means I'm taking some time off after the birth of my son. Consider this series to be like a substitute teacher. We won't go as in-depth as in previous episodes, but we'll briefly touch on a number of different topics in each show. This series focuses on Billy Joel's song, We Didn't Start the Fire, and the headline-making events and people he mentions. Some content may not be suitable for all listeners. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind We Didn't Start the Fire, 1964 through 1989, Part 2. Wheel of Fortune came on the air in 1975 when Merv Griffin had the idea for a game show based on the game Hangman. In the 1980s, Pat Sajak replaced Chuck Woolery as host. Vanna White signed on, and the show was moved to syndication and became the show most are familiar with today. Sally Ride was a physicist and the first American woman in space as a member of the Challenger shuttle mission of 1983. She beat out 1,000 applicants for a spot in NASA's astronaut program. But she wasn't the first woman in space. That title belongs to Valentina Tereshkova and the Soviet Union in 1963. When Billy Joel sang heavy metal suicide, it's hard to pinpoint if he was talking about heavy metal becoming more mainstream in the 1970s and 80s, and suicide separately referring to the increase in suicides during the 80s. Or if the lyrics were combined to refer to the lawsuits popping up against heavy metal acts like Judas Priest, claiming subliminal messages in the music were responsible for suicides of teenagers. Remember in the last episode when we talked about Reagan, I mentioned he is credited with cutting taxes. Well, he paired those cut taxes with increased funding on defense and didn't cut spending in other areas, leading to foreign debt. The burden caused an increase in inflation, and in 1988 the debt-GNP ratio was 53%, 20% higher than it was in 1980, before Reagan became president. Following the Vietnam War, many veterans weren't given the support and resources needed to combat problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder, leading many to seek self-medication in the form of drug addiction and alcoholism. The number of homeless people tripled during the 1980s, with an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 being veterans. When an unknown disease began spreading throughout the world, it was difficult to pinpoint exactly how it began, and those affected weren't responding to methods used to cure other diseases. It wasn't until the 1980s when the disease became known as Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, or AIDS, and it was discovered it was transmitted through the exchange of bodily fluids through unprotected sex, or the sharing of intravenous needles. In the 1970s and 80s, cocaine became the drug of choice for those in the party and yuppie scene, and when mixed with sodium bicarbonate or sodium hydroxide, it could be made into a solid as opposed to a powder, and smoked. Because the effects of crack can be felt quicker and doesn't last as long, it's considered more addicting and more dangerous. Bernie Goetz was riding the subway in 1984 in New York City when 4 black teenagers approached him demanding money. When he shot them, he permanently paralyzed one, but was acquitted of attempted murder. He was found guilty of carrying illegal firearms, but many believe his actions were justified, calling him the subway vigilante. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison and later declared bankruptcy when the teenager he paralyzed sued him and won a $43 million judgment. In the summer of 1988, while many New York families vacationed on the Jersey Shore, hundreds of hypodermic needles, along with beer cans, styrofoam containers, and various other contaminants began washing up on the shoreline, making news reports and headlines nationwide. It came to light that New York municipal garbage was being dumped into the Atlantic Ocean, with the idea it would just sink to the bottom of the ocean floor. In the summer of 1989, thousands of students began protesting in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China. When the Chinese government declared martial law, many were killed and the incident became known as the Tiananmen Square Massacre. And finally, to conclude this series, Rock and Roller Cola Wars refers to the rivalry between Coca-Cola and Pepsi at the time to become the world's #1 soda company, with both companies hiring celebrities to hawk their respective drinks. Coca-Cola hired Paula Abdul, and Pepsi hired Michael Jackson. And after researching these 40 years of headlines in preparation for this series and learning of all the turmoil the world has faced, it's no wonder Billy Joel finishes this verse with, "I can't take it anymore." Thanks for listening to The Story Behind and this 10-part series exploring all the references made in Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. Hopefully I'll be back from my baby break very soon. Although since I'm recording this before the baby comes, I'm not quite sure when that will be. But make sure you're subscribed to the show on your favorite podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. And follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at StoryBehindPod for updates. Thanks for listening.